Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Her True Stories. Before we dive into Amira's incredible story of justice and empowerment, I want you to know something important. If you're watching this channel, chances are you've dealt with toxic people who've tried to make you feel small, insignificant, or powerless. Maybe it's a family member who dismisses you, a colleague who undermines you, or someone who thinks your kindness means you're weak. Here's the truth they don't want you to know. You have more power than you realize. At any age, at any stage of life, you can reclaim your dignity and demand the respect you deserve. If you're ready to stop being a doormat and start being the architect of your own justice, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're building a community of people who refuse to be walked on, and your story matters here. And if you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Now, let me tell you about Amira, a 62-year-old woman who spent 18 years being treated like she was invisible until she decided to teach her tormentors a lesson they would never, ever forget. This story will show you exactly what happens when quiet strength meets calculated justice. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. There are women who mistake kindness for vacancy. They look at a soft voice and think it means there is no spine beneath it, nothing but air and manners. For 18 years, Cassandra mistook me like that. But it wasn't until my husband's funeral that I understood the true depth of her miscalculation. The first Christmas after she married my son, there were two tables. Family at one, overflow at another. The place cards were done in a careful hand I didn't recognize, and on the overflow table, propped against the napkin of a stranger, sat a card that said Amira H. It was the only card with an initial. She smiled at me from the main table like a hostess who had solved a seating problem. I smiled back and ate my dinner with the caterers in the kitchen. The salmon was dry, but the lesson was not. Years behave like tide when you're excluded. They keep coming. Birthdays you hear about from a neighbor. A christening photograph that appears on the internet with a caption that reads, "All the people who matter." The first time I tried to correct it, my son texted, "Mom, please don't make it weird." I stopped trying to correct it. I started counting instead. I counted the silences. I counted the thank yous that were never said. I counted the rooms I stepped around in my own mind so I wouldn't bruise. By the end of year 10, I could tell you what exclusion tasted like. By year 15, I'd learned that silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. The exclusion had a particular architecture. Wedding invitations that arrived 2 days after the ceremony. Holiday photographs where I'd been cropped out with surgical precision. Phone calls that went unanswered until I stopped making them entirely. My son, David, became a ghost who sent guilty texts on my birthday and forgot to call on Mother's Day. But it was my husband James's funeral that clarified everything. I sat in the front row, where widows belong, watching our friends and family file past his casket. Cassandra held court near the guest book, accepting condolences like she was the chief mourner. When my elderly aunt approached to sign, Cassandra actually redirected her. "Oh, family signatures are in the book on the left," she said sweetly. "That one's for close friends." My aunt, James's sister for 73 years, was relegated to the friends book while Cassandra's yoga instructor signed the family registry. That night, as I sat alone in the house James and I had shared for 35 years, I made a decision. I would use my grief productively. I would transform 18 years of accumulated silence into something more useful than tears. The inheritance was substantial. James had been better with money than anyone realized. Investment portfolios, life insurance, real estate holdings I'd never bothered to track. The lawyers spoke in numbers that sounded like mistakes until they showed me the documentation. You could buy a small country, my attorney joked, the same thing he'd said for years. But this time, I wasn't thinking about countries. I was thinking about islands, private spaces, controlled environments. When I found the oceanfront property, I knew immediately it was perfect. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it had been built by someone who understood that true luxury wasn't about comfort. It was about control. The previous owner had been a tech executive who designed his retreat like a fortress. Storm shutters that could seal the house completely, advanced security systems, backup power, water filtration, emergency supplies, everything necessary to survive isolation, whether voluntary or otherwise. I purchased it with cash and began my education in household systems. I learned about automated environmental controls, communication jammers that were for privacy, and the kind of hospitality that required careful planning. The agent who handled the closing said, "It feels like a fresh start." I said, "It feels like a finishing school." She didn't ask what kind of finishing I had in mind. I brought the pearls down from the city in a small velvet pouch and laid them on the newel post like the house had earned a decoration. The glass faced the sea the way a prosecutor faces a jury, with patient certainty that truth would eventually prevail. I spent 3 months learning the house's capabilities, testing its systems, understanding its potential. I practiced moving through the service corridors until I could navigate them in complete darkness. I memorized the locations of every control panel, every override switch, every emergency protocol. I was ready when the phone rang. A house that holds its breath will always reveal secrets. This one whispered to me from the moment I crossed the threshold, its voice like salt whined through bulletproof glass. The realtor had called it architecturally significant, code for beautiful and paranoid. The previous owner, Thomas Chun, had built it after his company went through a hostile takeover. He'd understood that wealth made enemies, and enemies required preparation. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the Atlantic, but they were impact-resistant polymer composites designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes. The storm shutters weren't decorative. They were tactical, creating a complete seal that could protect against everything from flying debris to unwanted visitors. I named the rooms privately, the way you name weapons. The living area became the theater, where performances would be staged. The long hallway was the gallery, where art would be displayed. My study overlooking the water was the observatory, where careful watching would turn into careful planning. The kitchen was designed for siege conditions, not the romantic kind food magazines featured, but the practical kind that assumed you might need to feed people who couldn't leave. Industrial refrigeration, commercial-grade storage, water purification systems that could run indefinitely. In the corner of the study hung a framed seascape, Chen's little joke. Behind the innocuous watercolor was the home's command center, environmental controls, security systems, communication jammers, and what Chen had privately called guest management protocols. The wine cellar was my favorite discovery. Not because of the excellent vintages Chun had left behind, but because of the ventilation system. It could be sealed independently from the rest of the house, creating a space that existed outside normal atmosphere. Perfect for storing things that needed to be preserved. I spent my first month learning the house's moods. How morning light revealed fingerprints on glass. How ocean sounds carried differently depending on weather patterns. How the automated systems responded to various emergency scenarios. The storm shutters were poetry in titanium and steel. They descended with mathematical precision, sealing the house so completely that outside and inside became abstract concepts. I tested them weekly, timing their deployment, studying their effects on air pressure and acoustics. The communication systems were equally elegant. Chun had installed jammers that could block cellular signals, internet connections, even emergency radio frequencies, if necessary. all perfectly legal when used for privacy protection on private property. The locals were curious about the woman who'd bought the fortress on the point. They'd nod when I walked through town, polite but cautious. I preferred it that way. Curiosity was more useful than friendship for what I was planning. I arranged the furniture to face inward, not toward the sea. Conversations would be the entertainment, and conversations required proper staging. The dining table could seat 12 comfortably, 24 if people were willing to be intimate. I made note of that number and smiled. Everything in the house worked in layers. Beautiful surface, functional depth, and beneath that, something with teeth. Like the sound system that could generate white noise to mask conversations or screams. Like the air purification system that could be adjusted to make the atmosphere uncomfortable without being dangerous. The service corridors were Chen's masterpiece. Hidden passages that connected every room, accessible through panels disguised as artwork or built into the architecture itself. I could move through my house like a ghost, observing without being observed, present without being detected. On my 30th night in the house, I stood on the deck and let the wind tangle my silver hair. The pearls at my throat caught moonlight and threw it back to the waves like promises made. For the first time since James's funeral, I felt like myself, not someone's widow, not someone's disappointment, not someone's afterthought. Just Amira, patient and prepared and ready. The next morning, Cassandra called. She said 24 like she was placing an order for furniture. Cassandra's voice came through the speaker with that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound both casual and inevitable. Amira, perfect timing. I hope you're settling in well. Listen, I have a tiny request. My extended family and some friends need accommodation this weekend. Nothing complicated, just rooms, meals, and space for about 24 people. The rental we had booked fell through at the last minute, and I remembered you have that big new place.
Can you handle that?
Not, would you be willing, or is it possible?
Can you handle that?
As if my capability was in question. As if 18 years of being dismissed had earned her the right to conscript my hospitality. I held the phone away from my ear and counted to 10. 1 pearl, 2 pearls, 3 pearls through 10. My grandmother's technique for keeping fury at serving temperature. When were you thinking? I asked, my voice honey smooth. This Friday through Sunday. We'll make a whole long weekend of it. Oh, and several people have dietary restrictions, so maybe plan for variety. You know how these things go. I didn't know how these things went. I'd been systematically excluded from how these things go for nearly 2 decades. But I was about to become an expert. Of course, I said. I'll make sure everything is exactly right. You're an absolute saint, Amira. I knew I could count on you. Oh, and don't worry about entertainment. We're pretty self-sufficient. Just comfortable beds and good food. You know. The call ended with the particular silence that follows a command disguised as a request. I set the phone on the kitchen island and looked out at the water. The weather forecast was promising, a significant storm system approaching the coast, expected to arrive Friday evening. Memory cascaded like dominoes falling. The funeral where I'd been treated like hired help. The family portrait where I'd been cropped out entirely. The Christmas, when Cassandra had asked me to help in the kitchen at my own son's house, then served dinner without inviting me to sit down. But this was different. This was Cassandra treating my sanctuary like her personal resort, my hospitality like a service she'd purchased. This was 18 years of contempt crystallizing into a single, perfect opportunity. I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with tactical eyes. 24 people. 24 bodies that would need food, water, air, space. 24 people who'd chosen to follow Cassandra into my domain without ever asking if I wanted them there. In the study, I opened Chen's files. The previous owner had left detailed documentation of every system, every capability, every contingency protocol. I spread the materials across the desk like battle plans. The approaching storm was perfect cover. High winds, heavy rain, power outages expected throughout the region. Emergency services would be busy with genuine crises. Cell towers would be overwhelmed or damaged. Roads might become impassable. I made my grocery order. Exactly enough food to look abundant while lasting precisely as long as I wanted it to last. 24 people would consume resources at predictable rates. I calculated portions like a quartermaster planning a siege. The guest book went on a stand by the front entrance, quality leather, heavy paper, the kind used for legal documents. Everyone would sign it. Evidence that they'd come willingly, stayed voluntarily, participated enthusiastically. My phone rang again. David's number. Mom, Cassandra told me about the weekend. That's really generous of you. My son's voice carried that careful tone he'd perfected over 18 years. Diplomatic neutrality designed to avoid choosing sides between his wife and his mother. He'd become fluent in the language of moral cowardice. I'm looking forward to meeting these important people in your lives, I said.
Right.
Well, if it gets overwhelming, just let me know. I'm stuck in Portland on business, but I can try to. Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything will work out exactly as it should. After I hung up, I sat in the observatory and watched storm clouds gather strength on the horizon. The waves were getting taller, more insistent. The house was starting to hum with wind pressure against the reinforced glass. I pulled out Chen's emergency protocols manual. The lockdown procedures were designed for hostile takeovers, kidnapping attempts, home invasions, situations where the house needed to become a bunker. Once initiated, the systems created complete isolation. No one in, no one out, no communication with the outside world. Perfect protection from external threats. I smiled and turned to the section on manual override controls. 24 people had spent 18 years assuming I would accommodate their comfort while they ignored my existence. 24 people were about to discover that assumptions could be expensive when held by the wrong person. Friday was 2 days away. Time enough to prepare the perfect educational experience. I prefer my lists detailed, my contingencies thorough. Thursday morning brought the kind of deceptive clarity that promises storm. I walked the perimeter of my property at dawn, timing routes and testing sight lines. From kitchen to service entrance, 43 seconds. From front door to wine cellar, 1 minute 12. From observatory to master bedroom, 37 seconds using hidden corridors, impossible if you didn't know they existed. The grocery delivery arrived precisely at 10, boxes of supplies that would photograph beautifully and disappoint mathematically. I arranged the visible food like a museum exhibition. Artisanal crackers fanned like playing cards, wine bottles lined up like chess pieces, fresh fruit displayed in bowls that caught morning light just so. The real supplies went elsewhere, through service corridors to storage spaces my guests would never find. Enough to keep one person comfortable for 2 weeks, carefully insufficient to sustain 24 people for more than 36 hours. I tested every system methodically. Storm shutters. Deployment time 2 minutes 40 seconds. Complete seal confirmed. Communication jammers. Cellular blocked. Internet severed. Even emergency radio frequencies disrupted. Environmental controls. Air circulation adjustable. Temperature modifiable. Humidity controllable. The weather reports held steady. Major storm system. Landfall Friday evening. Winds up to 80 miles per hour. Widespread power outages expected. Emergency services already positioning crews. Authorities advising residents to shelter in place and avoid unnecessary travel. Ideal timing. I programmed the sound system with multiple audio environments. Ocean ambience to mass conversations. White noise to prevent eavesdropping. Complete silence to amplify psychological pressure. The controls were accessible only from the observatory, giving me complete authority over the house's acoustic landscape. The wine cellar required special attention. I moved Chen's excellent collection to secondary storage and replaced it with cheaper bottles in expensive packaging. When desperate people started drinking strategically, I wanted to control what was available for consumption. Emergency supplies went into secured storage, battery-powered devices, portable radios, backup communications equipment. Not to help my guests, but to ensure I maintained contact with the outside world while they remained isolated. I charged every electronic device in the house, then removed all charging cables except those in my private spaces. Dead batteries would eliminate their ability to document their experience or call for help. The guest registry was positioned strategically, visible immediately upon entry, impossible to avoid. Heavy paper, permanent ink, clear signatures required. Legal documentation that everyone had entered voluntarily and signed acknowledgement of their presence. By Thursday evening, every detail was perfect. The house looked like a luxury hotel. Welcoming, sophisticated, completely normal. Only I understood the infrastructure beneath the hospitality. Only I knew how quickly comfort could become confinement. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it in the observatory while watching the storm build on the horizon. The waves were already aggressive, white-capping with warning. The air had that electric quality that precedes violence. My phone buzzed. Looking forward to tomorrow. Everyone's so excited to see your new place. You're an angel for hosting. See, an angel. After 18 years of being treated like hired help, she thought one weekend of service made me celestial. I touched the pearls at my throat and smiled. Angels, in biblical terms, were often instruments of judgment. And judgment, unlike mercy, didn't require forgiveness to be effective. That night, I walked through the house one final time, checking every lock, every sensor, every control. Tomorrow would bring 24 people who'd assumed my kindness was unlimited and my patience was permanent. Tomorrow, they would learn about assumptions. I set multiple alarms and reviewed my timeline. The lockdown would begin exactly at midnight Friday, giving them 12 hours to settle in and claim ownership of my space. The storm would provide natural cover for the next phase. By Sunday evening, they would understand the difference between a guest and an intruder. The last thing I did before bed was test the service corridor locks. All secure. Tomorrow, I would be the only person who could move through the house undetected. Tomorrow, I would finally have the advantage I'd been denied for 18 years. The ocean outside my window sounded patient. Like me. Luxury vehicles look like predators when they hunt in packs. Friday afternoon brought a convoy of German engineering up my crushed shell driveway. I watched from the observatory as doors opened and people emerged with the particular confidence that comes from never having been told their presence wasn't wanted. Cassandra stepped out of a white Tesla like a general surveying conquered territory. She wore flowing linen that probably cost more than most people's rent and sunglasses that reflected my house back at itself in miniature perfection. Behind her came the supporting cast I'd been excluded from meeting for 18 years. Patricia, Cassandra's mother, sharp angles and sharper opinions, already surveying my property with appraiser's eyes. Luna, her sister, phone raised to document everything for social media consumption. Blake, her cousin, practically jogging toward my front door with the eager hunger of someone who'd never met a valuable object he couldn't evaluate. The extended crew was exactly what demographics would predict. Victoria filming herself walking up my front steps, narrating for Instagram about spending the weekend at this incredible oceanfront estate. Jessica carrying a designer tote bag that looked conspicuously empty, ready for strategic shopping. Harrison puffing his chest and commenting loudly about security vulnerabilities he'd identified during his 30-second perimeter scan. I opened the door before they could knock, my best hostess smile calibrated to perfection. "Welcome," I said, stepping aside with gracious authority. "Please, make yourselves completely at home." The phrase was carefully chosen. They would indeed make themselves at home. The question was whether they would enjoy the full hospitality experience I'd prepared. Cassandra kissed air near my cheek and walked past me like I was architectural detail. Gorgeous place, Samira. Kitchen must be this way. Everyone's dying to see your setup. They flowed into my sanctuary like tourists invading a museum, all loud appreciation and casual appropriation. I positioned the guest book prominently, holding out a quality pen. Just so I can keep track of everyone, I said with grandmotherly warmth. Most signed without reading, hasty signatures and printed names, legal documentation that they'd chosen to enter my home, accepted my hospitality, participated willingly in whatever experiences followed. Blake was already opening drawers, ostensibly looking for wine openers but clearly conducting inventory. Impressive square footage, he announced to no one particular. What did this run you? Enough, I said, watching Victoria pocket a hand-carved shell paperweight while she thought I wasn't looking. The afternoon proceeded predictably. They clustered around the visible wine, exclaiming over labels they'd probably Googled. They repositioned my furniture for better photos. They explored rooms like they were considering purchase rather than visiting. Where should we put our bags? Cassandra. Is there more wine in that cellar? Patricia. Does the Wi-Fi reach the guest bedrooms?
Luna.
Mind if I move this art for better lighting?
Victoria.
I answered each question with increasing precision. Yes, there's guest accommodation upstairs. Yes, there's additional wine in controlled storage. Yes, there's Wi-Fi that will work exactly as long as I want it to work. No, the artwork is positioned deliberately and shouldn't be moved. As afternoon became evening, they spread through the house like infection finding healthy tissue. I watched them photograph my bedroom, rearrange my living spaces for better conversation flow, and raid my visible supplies like they were stocking for siege. But I watched them more carefully than they watched anything. I memorized their hierarchies, their dependencies, their individual pressure points. Patricia needed alcohol to remain social. Blake needed to touch and evaluate everything he encountered. Victoria needed constant content creation. Luna needed to be the center of digital attention. Needs were leverage waiting to be applied. By 5 o'clock, they'd settled into the rhythm of people who belonged somewhere without having earned the right. Music played from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Wine flowed from my carefully curated selection. Laughter echoed off my expensive glass like mockery set to melody. I excused myself to prepare dinner, the kind of elaborate spread that would photograph beautifully and disappear quickly. As I worked, their conversations drifted in from the main rooms. God, living in a glass house like this. So exposed. I'd feel like an animal in a zoo. She's obviously loaded. Look at these fixtures, this appliance setup. Wonder if she's updated her will recently. Cassandra, you should talk to her about modernizing the decor. Very dated aesthetic for someone with this much money. They discussed me like I was absent, which was familiar. They discussed my home like they were already dividing inheritance, which was educational. They discussed my hospitality like it was purchased rather than gifted, which was clarifying. As sunset painted the ocean in shades of warning, I called them to dinner. They approached the table with the casual entitlement of people who'd never connected consumption with consequence. The conversation flowed around me, gossip, complaints, plans that excluded me entirely. Weather's supposed to get nasty tonight, Patricia mentioned between bites. Good thing we're safely tucked away here, Cassandra replied. Perfect weekend for being inside somewhere beautiful. I agreed it was perfect timing. I agreed they were tucked away safely. I agreed with everything they said because agreement, unlike promises, could be redefined when circumstances changed. After dinner, they migrated back to the main living area to continue their performance of vacation. The storm was building outside, wind testing the reinforced windows, rain beginning to tap against glass like impatient fingers. They were too busy documenting their experience to notice how the house was beginning to change. I cleared dishes slowly, calculating consumption rates, noting preferences, timing their alcohol absorption. Then I excused myself to check on weekend preparations. In the observatory, I pulled up weather radar. The storm was perfectly on schedule, a massive system that would make the next 60 hours very interesting for anyone without options. I opened Chen's emergency protocol manual and reviewed the lockdown sequence one final time. At midnight, my guests would transition from visitors to students. At midnight, 18 years of accumulated education would begin. At 11:58, I walked through the house for final visual confirmation. Everyone was present, accounted for, and sufficiently relaxed. The party had reached that dangerous peak where alcohol made people funnier, louder, and more honest about their actual opinions. At 11:59, I returned to the observatory and removed the framed seascape from its hook. At midnight exactly, I initiated the educational protocol that would make this weekend unforgettable for everyone involved. The house began to hum. The hum was mechanical truth disguised as ambient sound. It started in the walls like blood starting to flow, barely noticeable at first, then undeniable as it spread through the house's circulatory system. The storm shutters began their descent with titanium precision, sliding down the floor-to-ceiling windows like slow-motion curtains closing on a performance that was just beginning. For 30 seconds, the party continued. Someone was telling an elaborate story about a disastrous vacation rental. Someone else was opening another bottle of my wine. Music continued playing from a Bluetooth speaker that was about to lose its connection to everything external. Then Luna looked up from her Instagram editing and said, what's happening to the windows? The conversation paused. 24 faces turned toward the glass that was disappearing behind military-grade shutters. The ocean view vanished section by section, replaced by brushed steel panels that reflected their shocked faces back at them like funhouse mirrors designed by an engineer. Storm shutters, Cassandra said, but her voice carried uncertainty. Amira, these are automated for weather protection, right? Exactly right, I said, settling into my chair like a conductor taking position. The system is designed to protect us completely from external threats. The shutters completed their descent with a series of definitive clicks as magnetic locks engaged. Air pressure shifted as the house sealed itself against the outside world. The party lighting suddenly seemed harsh, accusatory. The room contracted around them like a slow-closing fist. Blake was first to test boundaries, walking to the nearest window, running his hands along the shutter's edges, looking for gaps or manual releases. How do they open again? They don't, I said with grandmother-like patience. Not until conditions improve. Phones emerged like weapons drawn in a gunfight. 24 people suddenly very concerned about weather reports, emergency protocols, and why their cellular signals were showing no service. Probably the storm interfering with cell towers, I explained helpfully. Very common during severe weather events. The house's shielding is designed to protect against electromagnetic interference. Victoria was filming again, but her tone had shifted from excitement to nervous documentation. So, we're basically sealed in here until this passes? She tried to make it sound adventurous, but uncertainty leaked through her influencer training. Not sealed, I corrected gently. Protected. There's an important difference. Patricia walked to the front door with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied exit from anywhere. She turned the handle. The door moved half an inch, then stopped against the magnetic lock system that had engaged with the shutters. This is getting weird, Blake announced, waving his phone like a talisman. I'm getting 0 bars. Like, complete dead zone. The house functions as a Faraday cage during storm protocols, I explained with technical precision. Think of it as a luxury bunker with better wine. The murmur of concern was rising like tide. 24 people who'd assumed they could leave whenever convenient had just discovered that convenience was no longer available for purchase. Amira, Cassandra's voice cut through the growing anxiety. This is unacceptable. We need to be able to leave if we choose. What if there's an emergency? I looked at her with the same polite attention I'd given her commands for 18 years. What kind of emergency were you anticipating? The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette. Because what emergency could there be? They had shelter from the storm. They had heat, light, food, and each other's charming company. What more could 24 uninvited guests possibly require? Medical emergencies, Patricia said, her voice rising toward panic. Heart attacks, injuries, medication needs. I have comprehensive first aid supplies, I replied. And everyone signed my health disclaimer form in the guest book. What health disclaimer? I gestured toward the guest registry they'd all signed without reading. Standard liability waiver. Legal protection for the host when guests engage in voluntary recreational activities. The silence that followed was educational. 24 people who'd signed documents without reading them were discovering that signatures had consequences. This is insane, Jessica said, her voice echoing off suddenly oppressive walls. You can't just trap people in your house. I haven't trapped anyone, I said with calm precision. You chose to come here. You signed my registry. You accepted my hospitality. I'm simply ensuring you receive the complete weekend experience you requested. The sound system activated then, Chen's final touch. Ocean ambience flowed through hidden speakers, creating the artificial sound of waves and wind that masked any genuine noises from outside. The effect was both soothing and suffocating, like being inside a seashell that someone else controlled. Harrison tried the traditional male response. Physical intimidation. Look, lady, I don't know what kind of breakdown you're having, but this stops now. Open these shutters. Or what? I asked with genuine curiosity. The question deflated his bluster immediately. Or what, indeed? He could threaten me with violence, but violence would only confirm that he was the kind of person who threatened elderly women. He could demand legal consequences, but legal systems required communication with outside authorities. He could promise social retaliation, but social media required internet access. All his traditional tools of intimidation had been neutralized by circumstances beyond his control. The storm should pass by Sunday evening, I said helpfully. Weather services are predicting 72 hours of severe conditions. We have everything we need to wait it out comfortably. Cassandra's face had gone pale, but she was still trying to maintain control through familiar authority. When will the shutters open, Amira? I smiled and touched the pearls at my throat, my grandmother's pearls, worn by women who'd understood that patience was a form of power. When I determined that everyone has had sufficient time to reflect on their choices. That's when understanding dawned. Not trapped by weather or mechanical failure or any force beyond my control. Trapped by me. Trapped by design. Trapped by 18 years of accumulated silence, finally finding its voice. The lights dimmed to evening ambience, warm, intimate, and completely inescapable. The house settled around us like a closing book, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I was exactly where I wanted to be, with exactly the audience I'd been preparing for. 24 people who treated me like disposable furniture were about to discover what it felt like to be arranged for someone else's comfort. Sleep well, I said, rising gracefully from my chair. Tomorrow should be very educational for everyone. Panic is certainty, with its social mask removed. The transformation was anthropologically fascinating. Within 2 hours of lockdown, my uninvited guests had shed their party personas like expensive clothing that no longer fit the climate. Wine-flushed confidence evaporated. Casual entitlement curdled into something more primitive and recognizable. Harrison appointed himself crisis manager, Probably because he had the loudest voice and the most fragile ego. "There has to be an emergency override," he announced, prowling the sealed windows like a territorial animal. "Building codes require multiple egress points." He was correct about building codes. But codes assumed normal residential usage, not emergency bunker protocols. The overrides existed, hidden behind artwork in the observatory, accessible only to someone who knew Chen's security priorities. "I have tactical training," declared Blake, puffing his chest with borrowed authority. "I can get us out." His tactical training apparently consisted of CrossFit memberships and action movie marathons. He spent 45 minutes attempting to pry open a shutter with kitchen utensils before admitting mechanical defeat. The utensils bent. The shutters remained pristine. Meanwhile, Patricia tried to establish maternal hierarchy. "Everyone needs to stay calm," she declared, opening cabinets with increasing desperation. "Houses like this always have landline telephones." There was indeed a landline in the observatory, along with a satellite internet connection and emergency radio equipment. But the observatory was accessible only through service corridors that my guests didn't know existed. The food situation became apparent around 2 a.m. when the abundant dinner disappeared into 24 people's assumptions about unlimited hospitality. What had looked like plenty for a weekend party was revealed to be carefully calculated portions designed for one meal. "She has to have more food somewhere," Victoria whispered to Luna, not understanding how sound carried in the sealed house. "Rich people always have secret pantries." She was correct. I had extensive food storage, enough to keep me comfortable for weeks. But it was hidden in spaces they'd never think to search, behind doors they couldn't open, in areas that existed outside their mental map of my home. Patricia found the wine cellar around 3 a.m. and began working through a bottle of Bordeaux that cost more than most people's car payments. "This is kidnapping," she muttered with increasing volume. "False imprisonment. We could destroy her in court." "With what lawyer?" Blake asked, his tactical confidence evaporating. "Our phones are dead weight." That's when the real argument started. 24 people with 24 theories about what to do, who was responsible, how to escape. The artificial ocean sounds from my speakers masked their conversation from any outside observers, but I could hear every word through the service corridor's acoustic design. Luna was crying quietly in the corner, her Instagram persona cracking under pressure. Jessica had barricaded herself in one of the guest bedrooms. Harrison was doing aggressive push-ups in the hallway, burning off adrenaline that had nowhere productive to go. But Cassandra was magnificent in her denial. She kept insisting this was temporary, manageable, solvable through the right combination of reasoning and social pressure. She'd built her entire identity around the assumption that problems could be talked away or intimidated into submission. She was about to learn that some problems had been waiting 18 years for the perfect moment to introduce themselves. Around 4 a.m., I adjusted the water pressure, just slightly at first, enough to be annoying without being alarming. A few guests mentioned it, but Patricia dismissed their concerns. "Old houses have quirky plumbing," she said, as if my year-old smart home was some Victorian mansion with character flaws. The water wasn't quirky. It was controlled like everything else in my environment. The fluctuations were intentional, a gentle reminder that their comfort existed entirely at my discretion. By dawn, exhaustion had set in. 24 people who'd expected luxury accommodations were sleeping on couches and floors, competing for blankets and pillows like refugees from their own entitlement. The party guests had become inmates, and their hostess had become something they'd never bothered to understand. Scarcity reveals character like heat reveals invisible ink. Saturday morning brought clarity in ways I'd anticipated, but they hadn't prepared for. As reality settled over them like a weight they couldn't shift, my guests began displaying their authentic selves. And those selves were uglier than their social media profiles suggested. The food crisis reached critical mass by noon. Blake had inventoried the visible supplies and performed calculations everyone had been avoiding. "We'll be out of food by tonight if we keep eating like this," he announced. "We need rationing protocols." "Who appointed you quartermaster?" Patricia snapped, clutching a box of artisanal crackers like treasure. "I'm not letting some random relative dictate my meals." "Random?" Blake's voice rose with wounded privilege. "I'm trying to manage our survival while you're hoarding crackers like a doomsday prepper." The facade of civilized people cracked open, revealing the animal desperation underneath. Luna accused Jessica of hiding food in her room. Harrison accused Victoria of wasting water on cosmetic purposes. Cassandra accused everyone of not understanding the severity of their situation. I observed from hidden vantage points, moving through service corridors like an anthropologist studying specimens. The breakdown of social order was textbook predictable: denial, bargaining, anger directed horizontally instead of vertically toward the actual source of their powerlessness. Patricia attempted to establish geriatric authority. "I've been organizing family events for 30 years, she declared. "We need structure, not hysteria." Her leadership lasted until the visible wine supply evaporated. I had cases stored in areas they'd never locate, but the bottles they could access were consumed by people who'd treated my hospitality like an open bar with no closing time. "Where's the rest of it?" Patricia demanded, her voice shrill with withdrawal and indignation. "Houses like this don't have just 6 bottles of wine." "That's everything," I lied with grandmotherly sweetness. "I don't entertain much myself." The lie was strategic. Alcohol had been their social lubricant, their liquid courage, their method of maintaining the illusion that this was still a party. Without it, they were just 24 people trapped with someone they'd systematically underestimated. Victoria tried to weaponize documentation, recording video after video on her phone despite having no way to upload them. "This is going to destroy you," she told me during one of my scheduled appearances. "I have influence. People listen to me." "I'm sure they do," I replied calmly. "But influence requires an audience, and audiences require access to platforms you no longer possess." Her phone battery died that afternoon. Without chargers, I'd removed them all during preparation. Her digital weapon became expensive plastic. The real entertainment began when they started consuming each other. Blake accused Harrison of stealing his protein bar. Harrison accused Luna of monopolizing bathroom time. Luna accused Patricia of hoarding toiletries. But Cassandra provided the most instructive moment. Around 4 p.m., she confronted Jessica in the hallway, demanding to know where Jessica had hidden the extra food she was obviously keeping. "I don't have any extra food," Jessica protested. "Don't lie to me," Cassandra hissed. "I can see you're not losing weight like the rest of us." The accusation was medically absurd. They'd been without adequate food for less than 36 hours. But hunger and desperation don't operate on logic. They operate on fear, and fear makes people cruel in ways they never imagined possible. "You always were jealous," Jessica shot back. "Even in college, you couldn't stand anyone having something you didn't control." "Jealous." Cassandra's voice reached frequencies that seemed to vibrate the sealed windows. "Of you? You're nobody. You're a background character in my life story." There it was. The contempt that had always been there now turned on her former friend because desperation required targets and I remained untouchable in my service corridors. I chose that moment for another appearance, emerging with a small plate of cheese and crackers, enough for one person, artfully arranged to inspire competition rather than cooperation. "I thought someone might be hungry," I said to no one in particular. 24 pairs of eyes fixed on the food like predators spotting wounded prey. The portion was deliberately insufficient, calculated to inspire conflict rather than gratitude. "That's not enough for everyone," Blake observed with growing understanding. "No," I agreed pleasantly. "It's not." The fight that followed was anthropologically magnificent. Patricia lunged first, but Harrison intercepted her. Jessica tried to grab crackers during their struggle, but Luna blocked her path. Victoria began screaming about fairness, while Cassandra demanded order that no longer existed. In the end, the food scattered across the floor, trampled and wasted by people too desperate to share and too proud to cooperate. I watched the chaos with detached fascination, like observing animals at a watering hole during drought. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Cassandra said when the food fight ended and hostile silence returned. She was staring at me with something approaching comprehension. "You wanted us to destroy each other." "I didn't want anything," I replied truthfully. "I simply provided conditions for you to be yourselves without social constraints." She finally found the observatory. What she never found was insight. Sunday morning brought desperation to my door in the form of Cassandra's manicured fists pounding against my bedroom entrance. Not the main door. She'd tried that hours earlier. She'd somehow discovered a service corridor access point, though she clearly didn't understand the navigation system. "I know you're in there, Amira." Her voice carried the particular fury of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, discovering that authority was contextual. "This has gone far enough." I let her exhaust herself before opening the door, appearing in my silk robe and grandmother's pearls like I'd just stepped from a luxury spa rather than a hostage situation. "Good morning, Cassandra. You're up early." Her appearance told the weekend story better than words could. Designer clothes wrinkled and stained. Professionally styled hair matted and unkempt. Makeup smeared into abstract art under her eyes. She looked like what she'd always been beneath the polish, desperate, entitled, and finally, genuinely afraid. "Let us out." The words came through clenched teeth. "Whatever point you think you're making, just end this." "What point do you believe I'm trying to make?" The question stopped her because it required self-reflection, and self-reflection had never been included in her skill set. "I don't know," she exploded. "You're having some kind of psychotic break. This is what happens when bitter old women live alone too long." Old women. There it was again, the casual dismissal that had colored every interaction for 18 years. I was old, therefore irrelevant. I was alone, therefore pitiable. I was female, therefore manageable through volume and intimidation. "I'm 62, I said calmly. "The same age your mother was when she started planning your wedding without consulting me about anything." "That's completely different."
How?
Again, the question derailed her momentum. Cassandra's power had always come from never having to examine her own logic, never having to justify her casual cruelties, never having to face consequences for treating people like expendable props. But now there was nowhere to retreat from examination. No party to return to, no audience to charm, no exit to make when conversation became uncomfortable. "You want to know what this is about?" I continued, my voice never rising above conversational level. 18 years ago, you decided I didn't matter. You cropped me out of photographs, excluded me from celebrations, treated me like unwanted furniture in my own son's life. You never asked permission to reshape my family around your comfort. You simply did it. That's not. We never meant. You invited 24 people to my home without asking if I wanted to share my space. You assumed I would provide food, shelter, entertainment, and gratitude for the privilege of serving you. You never considered that hospitality might be a gift rather than an obligation you could command. Cassandra's face cycled through emotions like a broken slot machine: anger, denial, confusion, fear. She was searching for an argument that would restore her control, but control was no longer available for purchase. "Fine," she said finally.
Fine.
"You want an apology?"
I'm sorry. Okay.
"I'm sorry we didn't include you enough. I'm sorry we took you for granted." "Is that what you need to hear?" I studied her face for signs that the apology came from understanding rather than desperation. I found only calculation, the same calculation that had convinced her she could manage me for 18 years. What I wanted, I said, was to hear my own voice in my own home, speaking to people who chose to listen rather than people forced to listen. That's when she tried psychological retreat. Not physical, since the house offered no escape routes, but emotional withdrawal to familiar territory of moral outrage and victim status. "You're insane," she whispered, backing toward the corridor. "When we get out of here, and we will get out, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are." What am I, Cassandra? A bitter old woman who can't accept that the world moved on without her. I smiled then. The first genuine smile I'd worn all weekend. You're absolutely right. The world did move on without me. My son moved on without me. His wife and children and friends all moved on without me. But you know what I discovered in all that moving on? I stepped closer, close enough that she had to look directly into my eyes instead of over my shoulder at the exit she couldn't reach. I discovered that I didn't need any of you. I had resources you never bothered to calculate, strength you never tested, patience you never respected, and a very long memory you never thought to consider. I discovered that the woman you dismissed as irrelevant had been paying attention while you assumed she was paying attention to nothing. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the living area. Someone had finally snapped and thrown something at the sealed windows. Cassandra's head turned toward the noise like a dog, hearing its name called. "Your friends are learning that tantrums don't open doors," I observed. "Just like they're learning that entitlement doesn't guarantee outcomes and privilege doesn't create solutions." When she turned back, something had shifted in her expression. Not understanding, that would have required empathy she didn't possess, but recognition. The recognition that her power over me had been imaginary, sustained only by my willingness to pretend it was real. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "I have everything I want. The question is, what do you want from yourselves?" But that question exceeded her capacity to process. Cassandra had built her identity around taking rather than giving, consuming rather than creating, demanding rather than requesting. The idea of wanting something from herself was foreign as speaking Mandarin. Dawn is for those who survive their own education. Monday morning brought the kind of crystalline light that keeps promises made in darkness. I woke naturally at 5 a.m., made coffee in my private kitchenette, and watched through the service corridor's hidden window as the real storm finally moved out to sea, leaving the coast washed clean and glittering. At precisely 6 a.m., I initiated the shutdown sequence that would lift the storm shutters for the first time in 60 hours. The mechanical hum filled the house like a resurrection hymn. One by one, the titanium panels rose to reveal floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a world transformed by weather and time. The ocean stretched to the horizon, calm as polished glass, reflecting morning light like scattered promises finally kept. My guests stirred to consciousness slowly, blinking in sudden brightness like creatures emerging from a cave they'd convinced themselves was permanent. For a moment, nobody moved, as if they couldn't believe their prison had become transparent again, that the outside world continued to exist, that freedom had returned without their permission. Then the exodus began. 24 people who'd spent the weekend learning about the limitations of their own humanity suddenly remembered they had lives to return to, stories to craft, reputations to manage. They gathered belongings with desperate efficiency, as if staying one moment longer might trigger another educational cycle. I positioned myself in the kitchen, sipping coffee and wearing the same serene expression I'd maintained throughout their visit. They flowed around me like water around stone, avoiding eye contact, avoiding conversation, avoiding any acknowledgement of what had transpired between us. Patricia was first to reach the door, designer luggage in one hand and dignity in tatters. She paused at the threshold, looking back with something that might have been understanding if she'd been capable of that particular emotion. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said quietly. The words carried weight they'd never carried before. I nodded graciously. "You're welcome." I hope everyone found the experience educational. One by one, they filed past toward the exit, each offering their version of gratitude or farewell. Some mumbled appreciation. Some avoided words entirely. A few managed actual eye contact. But Cassandra lingered. She stood in my foyer with expensive luggage and rumpled dignity, looking like someone who'd lost something she couldn't name. When the last guest cleared the doorway, she turned to face me directly. "I don't understand what happened here," she said. "Yes, you do," I replied. "You just don't want to understand it." She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in our 18-year relationship, she was actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to speak. "You wanted to know what powerlessness felt like," I continued. "To be dependent on someone else's generosity. To discover that your comfort existed at another person's discretion. You wanted to understand what it meant to have no control over your circumstances, even if you didn't realize that's what you were asking for." Cassandra's face showed emotions I'd never seen her display: confusion, recognition, something that might have been shame if she'd been capable of it. "This changes nothing between us," she said finally. "It changes everything," I corrected. "You'll never look at me the same way. You'll never take my silence for granted. You'll never assume that kindness equals weakness or that patience equals powerlessness." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, trying to find an angle, a strategy, a way to reclaim the moral authority she'd occupied for so long. But there was no angle available. She'd demanded hospitality and received education. She'd assumed privilege and encountered consequence. She'd expected accommodation and discovered boundaries. "We won't be back," she said. "I know," I replied, "and I won't miss you." The words hung in the air like truth finally spoken after years of diplomatic silence. Cassandra flinched as if I'd struck her, but she didn't argue. She couldn't argue. We both understood I was correct. After she left, I walked through my house slowly, taking inventory of changes and damage. Furniture had been rearranged. Food had been consumed. Wine had been drunk. But nothing important had been broken, nothing that couldn't be cleaned, replaced, or forgotten. The guest book remained on its stand, filled with signatures from 24 people who'd learned more about themselves in one weekend than they'd learned in years of comfortable living. I added a final entry: educational retreat, weekend intensive, objectives achieved, students advanced to next level, instructor retirement with honors. Then I closed the book and stored it in my desk drawer, next to Chen's blueprints and emergency protocols and all the other tools I'd used to orchestrate their education. Cleanup took most of the morning. I worked methodically, restoring my sanctuary to its pre-invasion state. Fresh linens, restocked pantries, clean surfaces. Everything perfect again. Everything mine again. By afternoon, the house felt like itself. Spacious, bright, peaceful, filled with ocean light and the sound of waves that belonged to everyone and no one. I made lunch and ate it on the deck, watching seabirds hunt while the sun warmed my face. My phone buzzed. "Mom, Cassandra said the weekend went well. Thanks for hosting everyone. You're incredible. David." I deleted the message without responding. Some conversations belonged to the past, and some relationships existed only in the spaces between what people said and what they understood. That evening, I walked the Strand barefoot, letting salt water wash over my feet while the tide erased footprints left by weekend visitors. The pearls at my throat caught the last sunlight and threw it back to the sea like promises fulfilled. I thought about the book I would write, not a memoir, but a guide for women who'd spent years being underestimated, overlooked, and undervalued. A handbook for those who'd learned that patience wasn't passive, that silence could be strategic, and that the most elegant revenge was simply allowing people to reveal their authentic selves when they thought no one important was watching. The title came to me as I reached the rocky point where my property ended and the wild shore began. The Art of Strategic Hospitality, Teaching Grace Through Natural Consequences. Tomorrow I would call my attorney and ensure my property deed included specific language about guest rights and host responsibilities. I would upgrade my security systems and install additional monitoring capabilities. I would prepare for the possibility that other entitled people might someday mistake my kindness for availability. But tonight, I would sit in my observatory with excellent wine and watch the ocean work its eternal magic, wearing down coastlines, reshaping landscapes, proving that given enough time and patience, water always changes everything it touches. Just like truth eventually transforms everything it encounters, even when it takes 18 years to find its voice. The house settled around me like a satisfied sigh, and for the first time since David's wedding, I felt completely, perfectly, unshakably at peace. At last, the house had taught them how to keep a promise. And that's how Amira transformed 18 years of silent suffering into one weekend of perfect justice. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure, never stooped to their level. She simply created conditions where her guests could show the world exactly who they really were, and they did. Here's what I love most about Amira's story. She didn't wait for someone else to give her permission to demand respect. She didn't apologize for having boundaries. She didn't try to be the bigger person by accepting unacceptable behavior. At 62 years old, she decided her peace was worth more than their approval, and she acted on that decision with surgical precision. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed, excluded, or treated like you don't matter, I want you to know that Amira's strength lives inside you too. You don't have to accept disrespect from anyone, no matter how they're related to you or how long you've tolerated their behavior. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with real strategies for building the kind of unshakable confidence that Amira discovered. It's not about becoming cruel or vindictive. It's about becoming so secure in your own worth that other people's opinions can't touch your peace. Whether you're dealing with toxic family members, manipulative friends, or anyone who thinks they can walk all over you, this book will show you how to reclaim your power with dignity and grace. Click the link in the description right now and start building the life you deserve. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Amira didn't. She saw an opportunity and she took it. Your opportunity is right here, right now. Now I want to hear from you. What's the most elegant revenge you've ever witnessed or experienced? Have you ever had to deal with someone like Cassandra, who treated you like you were invisible? Drop your stories in the comments. This community is here to support each other, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If you believe that kindness is not weakness, that boundaries are not cruelty, and that some people need to learn respect the hard way, give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to be walked on, and hit that notification bell because trust me, we have more incredible tales of strategic justice coming your way. Remember, you're never too old to start over, never too quiet to demand respect, and never too kind to enforce consequences. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. Your peace matters more than their comfort. Until next time, stay strong, stay strategic, and never forget, the best revenge is living so well that your enemies become irrelevant to your happiness. I'll see you in the next story, where we prove once again that underestimating the quiet ones is always, always a mistake.